One of the worst parts of this year's U.S. presidential election was how the candidacy of Donald Trump gave a platform and a megaphone to some of the most vile elements of American society.
People I disagree with having a platform? And being heard? Jesus, we need to educate these people. Didn't they consider my feelings at all?
But one of the best parts of this year's election was how, by amplifying those harmful elements, it exposed them to mainstream scrutiny for the first time that I can remember.
Yes, it's very important that any and all ideas be scrutinized because that's how we evaluate their merits. In fact, I'd say anyone who insulates themselves from ideas they disagree with is doing themselves a great disservice. Don't you agree, Steve?
Didn't wind up making a difference in the result of the election, unfortunately, but you know the old saying, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, all hope in everything.
The world isn't about to end. You lost an election. An election where the two main candidates were so disliked, one of the main reasons people voted for Trump was that they didn't want to vote for Clinton. That doesn't mean they align themselves with Trump's policies or that they approve of his personal behavior. It means they thought on the margins, and after doing the lesser of two evils calculation, he's the side they ended up on. Do not ignore the major flaws with Clinton as if they were a non-factor.
Anyway, one of those harmful elements is rape culture. Rape culture is not a new concept, despite some anti-feminists insisting otherwise. Rape culture is an environment in which rape is prevalent and sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture.
I've never heard someone attempt to refute rape culture by citing how recently the idea had been conceived. The point I see argued most often is that we don't fit that definition of a rape culture in the United States.
That definition comes from the Marshall University Women's Center's webpage, which is a great starting point for learning about this subject.
I'll accept the definition of rape culture you've provided for the sake of argument, but really I'm under no obligation to do so. To include societal attitudes on sexual violence in the definition of rape culture seems to make that definition needlessly broad. That's not an attempt to undermine the severity or importance of addressing sexual violence. It's just to draw a distinction between sexual violence and rape, which are different things. And because they are different things, I don't think they should both fall under the term rape culture. But regardless, I'll accept this definition going forward.
The Marshall University Women's Center's webpage has a list of attitudes and behaviors that perpetuate rape culture, many of which Donald Trump has been demonstrating through his words and deeds for decades. But for our purposes, let's focus on one particular example, the infamous Billy Bush tape.
You didn't give a definition of rape or sexual violence during your initial spiel, but I should hope that consent is a key aspect of whatever definition you're using, and if someone consents, it was not rape or sexual violence. That idea of consent is going to be really important in a few seconds, so I hope you considered it.
Where Trump is heard bragging about how easy it is to assault women when you're a star. The tape begins with Trump bragging about unsuccessfully trying to sleep with a married woman. Then he goes on to boast that when you're a star, you can just start kissing women and they let you do it. You can do anything, even, quote, grab them by the pussy.
Let you do it. Those are four very important words, because what that could mean is that they didn't resist, which would still be sexual assault, or what it could mean is that because he's rich and famous, they consented, that they didn't have a problem with it. Now, I grant that this is something you're probably not too familiar with, but women will let you touch their genitalia on occasion, under certain circumstances.
Following the release of the tape, Trump attempted to excuse his behavior by dismissing it as, quote, locker room talk. Someone dismissive of the concept of rape culture might point out that Donald Trump insists that he has never actually done any of the things that he brags about doing on the Billy Bush tape. One might also argue that these are the terrible attitudes of just one person, and they don't prove that rape culture is a valid concept when applied to the United States as a whole.
Some might also argue that even if he did precisely what was said in those tapes, it still wasn't necessarily sexual assault, but I get the distinct impression you're not going to be addressing that.
Unfortunately, These arguments are refuted by the facts. The United States is a rape culture, and the reaction to the Billy Bush tape by a significant portion of the American people proves it.
That you use the word prove leads me to think that you're going to be resistant to any arguments that go contrary to your position, even prior to you hearing out those arguments. Prove is a very strong word, and as someone who self-identifies as a skeptic, you should not be throwing it around flippantly. Always be open to the possibility that you are wrong.
Let's start with Trump's explanation that what we hear on the Billy Bush tape is simply, quote, locker room talk. I'm going to give Trump's words on that tape the most charitable reading possible and imagine that Trump has never actually done the sorts of things that he describes himself doing on that tape. For the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that what we hear Donald Trump saying on that tape is nothing more than, quote, locker room talk.
Really? That's the most charitable interpretation of Trump's words you could come up with? You sure you didn't want to consider that for a few extra minutes? That Trump indicated that the women he was talking about let him do the things he described? That didn't play into your interpretation at all. The perspective of the women was irrelevant to you, or maybe you just assumed what the women's position was. Alright, Mr. Feminist.
He's bragging about imaginary sexual assaults to his fellow men because he assumes, correctly, as it turns out, judging by the reactions of the other men on that tape, that they will respond with approval and admiration. What was that definition of rape culture again?
And how does your less than charitable interpretation of Trump's words fit that definition of rape culture? No rape occurred, or was alluded to. No sexual violence occurred, and as such it cannot be excused. And a normalized response to the illusion of sexual violence still isn't a normalized response to sexual violence. No, this does not fit your definition. And that's even granting that he was alluding to sexual violence, which, as I pointed out previously, is not necessarily the case.
Don't go far, I'm going to need you again in a second. Now let's consider how people responded to Trump's locker room talk excuse. True, many of us didn't buy it, but many of us did. In fact, many of us echoed it ourselves, saying that we and other men that we know talk about women that way all the time. So not only was Trump correct when he assumed that his bragging about being able to sexually assault women would be met by the approval and the admiration of the other men on that Access Hollywood bus, many of us stepped forward and said that we do the exact same thing all the time.
Can you quantify what you mean by many when you say many of us can empathize with Trump's position? Because for a time, it seemed as though that tape was going to cost him the entire election. There was an overwhelming negative response to that, and people who continued supporting him tended to support him in spite of the tape, not because of it.
So if we live in a society where people regularly brag about sexually assaulting others in order to impress people, and we do it so regularly and are so comfortable with it that we seem to not understand why other people are upset by it, how might you describe such a society?
A normalized response towards the illusion of sexual violence still isn't a normalized response to sexual violence, and does not fit your definition. But even if it did, the United States still wouldn't fit that definition, because there was an overwhelming negative response to that tape. That this single comment wasn't enough to lose him the election doesn't mean there was widespread support for the comment. There was widespread support for Trump. Or more specifically, widespread support against Hillary.
Let me reiterate that those who accepted and repeated Donald Trump's locker room talk excuse have already admitted that we live in such a culture where people feel at liberty to brag about committing sexual assault in order to impress their buddies.
We would be at liberty to do that even if it never occurred, because that's what it means to live in a society that values free expression. Your revulsion at people having the liberty to say things that make you uncomfortable is both disgraceful and horrifying. Not your revulsion to what they said, but to their ability to say it.
Whether or not they are actually committing these crimes is beside the point. The crime of sexual assault is taken so lightly that it's considered praiseworthy to claim that you do it. And if you have already admitted that we live in such a society, you have admitted that we live in...
You have no grounds to be that smug when you constantly throw up a definition that refutes your own argument.
But wait, someone might object. According to that definition, a rape culture is not merely an environment where rape is excused and normalized, but where rape is prevalent. And if we are assuming for the sake of argument that Trump and others who engage in locker room talk aren't actually committing the sexual assaults they brag about committing, how can we say that rape is prevalent in the United States?
Before you move on to what you're going to say, let me remind you that your previous position was that America's reaction to the Billy Bush tapes was your proof that we were living in a rape culture. You are now backpedaling and are going to provide different proof.
According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in the year 2014, the most recent year for which I could find data, there were 284,350 rapes and sexual assaults reported in the U.S. To put that number in perspective, that same year there were 33,599 total gun-related deaths, according to the Centers for Disease Control. There were also 47,055 drug overdose deaths that year, again, according to the CDC.
And how is this a useful perspective? Putting aside the fact that the rape statistics you can get for the United States vary wildly depending on what source you go to, how is examining rape's prevalence in relation to other crimes relevant when evaluating rape's prevalence as a whole? Wouldn't it have been better to compare the United States rape rate to other countries' rape rates to see whether or not we're living in a rape culture where other countries aren't? Deaths caused by guns and drugs are not comparable to rape.
Just in case that isn't pervasive enough for you, let me present for your consideration one final bit of information, also from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. On average, an estimated 211,200 rapes and sexual assaults went unreported to police each year between 2006 and 2010. So take the 284,350 rapes and sexual assaults reported in 2014 and assume there were at least another 200,000 that occurred but weren't reported.
I find claims about unreported statistics to be a bit dubious because in order for the Bureau to get unreported rape statistics, someone would have had to have reported how they didn't report their rape. And seeing as there are also gun deaths and drug overdoses that go unreported, why did you leave those graphs the same? Additionally, a claim of rape isn't necessarily a rape. As someone who self-identifies as a skeptic, you should keep that in mind. Something else that isn't rape is sexual assault, which you've alluded to is included in these statistics.
An environment where rape is prevalent and sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture. That's us. And Donald Trump is our mascot. And our next president.
The term prevalent is subjective. Throwing out a flat number and declaring it as prevalent does not make your case, especially when you used words as lofty as prove earlier in your video. There are countries where the punishment for rape is negligible. Countries where marital rape isn't considered rape. Countries where if the victim comes forth as being a rape victim, they will be tried for adultery. If you lump the United States in with these countries because the president-elect said a sleazy comment on a bus 11 years ago, you minimize the impact rape should have as a term. It's because of arguments like this that you now have someone you hate in the presidency. Congratulations.